Dr. Eric Racine will conclude the panel. He is the director of the Neuroethics Research Unit and associate research professor at the Institut de Recherches, Cliniques in Montreal. He holds academic appointments at the University of Montreal and at McGill, and is a new investigator in the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Dr. Racine is currently associate editor of the journal Neuroethics, a member of the editorial board of the AJOB, Neuroscience. He's a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute for Neurosciences, Mental Health and Addiction, and a member of the Dana Alliance for Brain Initiatives. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon. And it's really a humbling moment in my academic life to be here. Honestly, what I'll try to do is speak to the issue of public understanding of neuroscience and the media representation of neuroscience from mostly an ethics standpoint, and an ethicist who actually conducts quite a bit of empirical research, and I think you'll see signs of that as I move ahead. Thank you. So basically, I've structured my few notes here around three what I think are considered important questions. First of all, why does this issue of public understanding of neuroscience matter actually from an ethics standpoint? It could be important for funding, for research. Why does it matter for ethics? Second, what are some potentially problematic aspects of media coverage and science communication in neuroscience? I'll try to give you a glimpse at this based on research we've conducted. And finally, what are solutions? And I think I'll concur with many of the previous comments on this. So first of all, sorry, this is not coming out tremendously well, but first question, why does it matter? And I think we have to look at both sides of this question. And basically, one answer is it doesn't really matter. From a descriptive and normative standpoint, there are potentially many reasons why we shouldn't be concerned too much about this. Because, for example, it could be viewed as outside of the purview of neuroscientists, for example. Neuroscientists are not equipped to deal with issues that are of relevance here. There's not enough evidence showing the existence of problems. There's nothing impactful that could be done to remediate any problems. Or finally, one could argue that neuroscience is no different than other areas of biomedical science. So why would this matter? A response from a descriptive standpoint would be to stress that now research encompasses knowledge transfer, so not as narrowly construing science as we used to. The public expects also return on investment and wants to know and is very curious about the brain and neurosciences. There could be some impactful results in neuroscience, and there is some evidence, even if it's suboptimal, that there are significant challenges, and I'll try to show that. From a normative standpoint, one can consider that communication is actually an act like many other acts and can be analyzed from an ethics standpoint, whether it's virtue-based, consequence-based, or principle-based. It's still an act. To retort to the idea that neuroscientists would have to carry the full weight, interdisciplinary models can be developed, solutions can involve multiple stakeholders, and one could argue that science can actually contribute to an enlightened public sphere. So again, concur with previous comments. So that I think it's important to look at both sides of the equation. In the background, I think it's important to keep in mind that one of the underlying issues that neuroscience stages is the conflict between the manifest and the scientific image of the world, as to paraphrase Wilfrid Sellers, the philosopher. Neuroscience, I think, stages this conflict of how we view ourselves based on our own self-understanding versus how science and neuroscience depicts us. We talked this morning about determinism, and this shows up in media coverage of neuroscience and invests the power that we think that applications such as fMRI will have, but you'll also find, in the words of neuroscientists, important claims that neuroscience will actually change how we view human nature. It's going to provide a new metaphysical mirror, for example, Joshua Green argues. So that sets a bit the stage. But what are some potentially problematic or challenging aspects of communication? And I'm pulling from work here that we've published. I'm just featuring these references for maybe the commission staff wanting to look at the details. But basically, if we try to boil it down to a few key observations, we found, for example, that reporting practices were suboptimal, that balanced tone in media coverage was not predominant. This is all neuroscience-related media coverage, that there were important shortcomings in medical and scientific explanations that could be remediated potentially. Whenever there's an ethics controversy, multiple sources of information come in. So it's not a matter of viewing the media as only a channel for information. It becomes very quickly a forum where different voices come in and different stakeholders. Media coverage could lead to hype misunderstanding. Media coverage can have an impact on public health behavior. And public understanding, interestingly, in our research has been found to be a key issue. When you interview or talk to researchers or clinicians, that's acknowledged to be an issue. But when you look at the available guidance from an ethics standpoint, there's not much to guide them. So I'll just try to flesh out very quickly some of these observations. I've picked a couple. This slide shows that, for example, when you look at media coverage of neuroscience and consider the need for replication and reporting of small n's in many of the fMRI studies, that's not information you'll find frequently, for example. Another key observation was a couple of years ago when we encountered a new form of interpretation of neuroscience research. We dubbed that neurorealism, and basically, to again paraphrase Sellers, it means that the scientific image overpowers the manifest image. Whatever fMRI says will be more real than real, basically. So that's the idea. When it's shown by fMRI or by neuroimaging, it gains additional power and impact. Another interesting observation was found when we analyzed media coverage of neurostimulation techniques, such as deep brain stimulation. Can't go into much details here, but there was increasing coverage in the decade we analyzed. Then after, when we look at the headlines featuring these stories, there were two key messages. It's going to have broad impact from a clinical translational standpoint, and these techniques constitute major scientific breakthroughs. Now, that was a lot of hype. I've never seen so much hype in all the media coverage. We've done media coverage analyses. Then interestingly, when we did a multi-site study of neurosurgical units in Canada, this was an interview-based study with clinicians, we actually encountered that when dealing with patients with Parkinson's or neuropsychiatric conditions, these clinicians reported that not only the state of desperation of these patients was compounding expectations, but media coverage. This is indirect evidence, but it's showing that potentially media coverage, when it's hype, can have an impact on informed consent, and importantly, in this area of clinical practice, actually lead to disappointment and failure to meet outcomes. That's, I think, very important to keep in mind. Just some last slices of data showing here, for example, data from a Canadian study of neuroimagers. We were interested in how they were viewing REBs and the whole research ethics governance dealing with this range of issues. And actually, surprisingly, knowledge transfer, public understanding came up as an important area for these researchers. As I already mentioned, and this is a really detailed slide, I only want to get you to think about the overall picture, is when we look at the International Research Ethics Guideline in different countries, we could actually report in a single slide what was available to cover areas such as public understanding, knowledge translation. If we look at confidentiality and informed consent, we wouldn't have enough of many afternoons to cover this material. So I think this speaks to the lack of guidance and lack of clarity on what should be the researchers' responsibilities in dealing with these kinds of issues. Now, what can we do? I think we can look at this as a challenge or a difficulty or as an opportunity. And I think there are probably different interesting models and incentives that could be put forward to try to remediate different aspects of the situation. This is a detailed slide. I only want to pull out the 3 key recommendations that were featured in this paper led by my colleague Judy Illes. And basically it was came from a workshop that we had in Alberta the Banff Center. And basically, 3 key recommendations came up. A paradigm shift in academic culture to value public communication. If this is not valued like teaching or research, how can we actually get researchers to be engaged if it doesn't count? Count in different ways, but if it doesn't count. The second recommendation was to train and support experts or knowledgeable individuals that have a foot both in neuroscience and another foot in journalism or science communication. So can we develop models of people with broader skills? And a third recommendation with, again, many different ideas packaged under that was basically also to try to develop and carry more empirical, conceptual research on science communication and its importance from an ethics standpoint. So in conclusion, I think public communication, public understanding do represent a potential source of harm, if you want, or challenges from an ethics standpoint. They also, interestingly, I think, constitute a terrain of ethical duties and obligations where neuroscientists can fulfill, I think, some of their commitments to science and an informed public sphere, and I think is also an important area of empirical and normative research. And I'll also thank my funders. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you all. Quite a range of topics across that table.